So why does this all matter to networks? It's all very interesting, but why does it matter for this subject? Well, first of all, what we should have gathered intuitively by now is that narrative and communication puts us in place. It gives us an image and an imaginary of our world. And our places, therefore, in networks or otherwise, also determine our perspectives. So a few weeks ago, we learned about Mark Granovetter's seminal article on the strength of weak ties. And we thought about strong ties and weak ties. So if you think about the people you are most likely to receive information from, we could perhaps suggest that ethos now has become to us more important than ever. We're no longer in Plato's Athenaeum, where only those who are selected to give information are of the same background as us, with the same education as us, living in a small city-state. We are communicating over large spaces and places and through gigantic networks. And we're more likely to receive information from those that we trust. So ethos and credibility has become more important than ever, which raises the question, who do you trust in terms of the information you receive? Does your information and credibility come from your organic community of friends, of family, of strong ties, people you are clearly linked to? Perhaps it's your neighborhood or your uni or your institutional affiliation. As an academic, is that your organic community of people from whom you get your strong ties? Is it open to outside views, otherwise known as weak ties? If it's open to those outside views, how often is it open to views that are very, very different to your own? If you are always getting your views from one Facebook feed, for example, or one Google aggregate feed, for example, is that really a set of weak ties? Are those fairly strong for you? The algorithm may begin to think that those are strong ties for you. So here you can see we're beginning to talk about the structure of our networks. And we're going to ask, how do communication networks structure also our view of ourselves and our communities and our world? And tying back to our first key concept, what are the power structures in these communication networks? Now, immediately, when we talk about whether our strong ties are our family or whether they're perhaps corporate mega-owned Mark Zuckerberg monopolies such as Facebook, we're talking about organic versus commercial structures. And this is bringing in Marxist theory. So a German sociologist called Jürgen Habermas took Marx's idea of the organic community. So the organic community in Marx's terms was the people that you had strong ties with. They were your family, they were your hood, they were your feudal kind of manor or your duchy, your small community or city-state, right? They were people that you had a lot to do with. They were your organic community. And Marx noted that this profoundly changed in the age of industrialization, where there was mass mobility and people moving to factory jobs. Or perhaps science of industry who were owning those factories in many different places sometimes. So Jürgen Habermas thought about that same change in society. And he was interested in it, not so much in terms of the economic implications, but in terms of the implications of these structural changes for communication and narrative and information. So this is a phrase that's coined by Jürgen Habermas, and he had a book that came out in 1989 called The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere that remains seminal in social theory today. What he was really interested in was that this organic structure was a discursive place in which individuals and groups associate to discuss matters of mutual interest and where possible reach a common judgment about them, kind of like the Athenaeum. And he was looking at it in terms of, and this is how Fraser describes Jürgen Habermas, a theater in modern societies in which political participation is enacted through the medium of talk. And so he looked at the birth of the coffee house in the 1700s. And he was very interested in this as a period that unsettled common ideas about society, because it was a place where people from any background could get together. It wasn't like the pub where people are going to get drunk. It was a place where they were going to soberly have a conversation, and women were allowed in these places, not just men too. So people from across the city were coming to talk about ideas. Why this was so important was because up until this time, as we'll learn later, there were very few newspapers. This was the period that we saw kind of the birth of the modern newspaper as we know it today. And it was a period in which literacy was still a relative rarity as well, but it was growing because we're a few hundred years after the birth of the printing press. So people were educated enough to begin to discuss ideas about how they thought their community should be run. And Habermas and many have noted that it led to the English Civil War, in fact, to the overthrow of the sovereign of England and to the charisma of Cromwell and the First Republic that was formed before the restoration of the monarchy in England. So that was actually the first kind of democratic revolution, although it was ultimately unsuccessful in some ways because they did have a restoration of the monarchy. But during the restoration, there was at least a national constitution that was put forward and a parliament that was held account to it. And they had, therefore, the birth of a form of Commonwealth government like we have now. So Habermas theorized that this could never have happened without the coffee house, which he said was the first organic public sphere where people from any background, not just from a family background or not just of a particular class or sex, could gather. And he said it was important to the birth of democracy, but ultimately, it was subsequently kind of swindled away, I guess, as the press later on became commercialized. So just a reminder here that prior to this period, people lived in a society dominated by powerful monarchs such as the Sun King Louis XVI, who so-called represented people in the image of God. And this was the period in which people were unsatisfied with that. There was huge economic inequality. We eventually saw the American and the French Revolution and the emergence of participatory democracies, vigorous public debate, open for conversation. And when Charles II, who was the restored monarch after his father Charles I was beheaded, came back to lead the new Commonwealth of England with its parliament as their monarch, he famously attempted to outlaw them because they were so powerful in generating a public consensus. And that's why Habermas theorized them as being a really important organic structure. Now, other structures that we might want to think about. So the previous one was thinking about whether the network is an organic one. So strong ties with maybe some weak ties is what we're seeing happen in the public sphere. That's the period of Habermas theorizing the emergence of the coffee house. But here I want us to be thinking about not just organic versus commercial, but also how technological structures and their changes over time and their transformations in technology actually shape the way we think. And this is where your second reading comes in today. So basically, we are looking at a giant transformation over thousands of years in society where people primarily gathered their information from the spoken word. It was an age of orality when the church held sway because to be able to read was such a remarkable thing. To be able to hold a book, which was such an expensive thing, was a precious object. Images were conveyed to people ideas about God and about theology because people couldn't read. And so, as Bono famously said in a concert he gave in Rome, you could think of the stained glass windows of the cathedrals as kind of the first movies, right? And theorists have subsequently thought about, well, how power worked differently then and how people thought about the world differently when most people were oral and only very few people had the ability to read and write. They certainly held the key to power in that network. But as that transformed into first scribal culture, where more and more monks came into monasteries and were learning how to write, and then secular people were learning how to write, and we were seeing paper being a more common commodity of exchange, theorists have thought about how that changed then too. And then when we see the birth of movable print with the Gutenberg press around the year 1500, we see changes yet again. And then again, we finally see the emergence of electronic media, first, of course, via the radio, and then the cinema and film and TV, and now finally the digital sphere. So we're going to think briefly about how those structures have changed communication and the way that we think about them. And we're going to think about them in terms of what I'm going to call technologies of inscription, technologies of writing or communicating. So Walter Ong is your go-to guy if you're interested in people who've theorized orality. His ideas are quite old now, but people build on them. So that's why it's important to know that he is still very prominent in the field. And he was interested in how during a period when most people could only communicate by sound, that it meant for a particular way that they related to the world. So we have these giant epics such as Homer's The Odyssey, which is characterized by a lot of onomatopoeia or repetition, alliteration, or rhyme. He said those were sound devices that were important for memory because people needed to remember very long tracts of text if they were producing an epic. They were rehearsed again and again. He also talked about how information was transmitted mostly in families or in households or communally, right? Dominated by archetypal symbols. And therefore we get the importance of the folktale in this particular period. So this is what Ong said happened in terms of one of that first transformations we went through as a society when we went from orality to the emergence of literacy. Now, literacy in the beginning of scribal culture where you have monks and they're writing things, and you have a priest and he's reading the Bible, and there were very few Bibles around. This was a period, Ong said, in which authority began to be conferred outside of the strong ties of one's family group to perhaps the broader ties of your church community, giving certain people, of course, in the position of that network, positions of power, and others positions of domination, being dominated by that priest. Empowered, perhaps, some would say, and oppressed, others would say, too. And he said this was a profound shift because the authority that was invested in the word was in some ways different, whilst there was still illumination going on, so letters and pictures were still important. The power was conferred on one single educated interpreter who was a patriarch or a priest who was given high status. And there was this idea that meaning was fixed and not something to be negotiated amongst a family group, for example. And then we have the rise of the printing press, and Eisenstein is your go-to theorist from that. Now, what she's really interested in is what happened in society when we went from scrolls and scribes and hand presses to movable text, being able to print many, many things in exact copies very, very quickly, and therefore more cheaply. And she said it was a communications revolution that also facilitated another shift in another episteme. It facilitated the scientific revolution. It facilitated a way of thinking where people were able to question more. Well, wait a minute, I saw that in that book and that other thing in that book. Those two books are supposed to be the same copy. So what was the original? Was a book that was a debate that people started to have in theology, for example, or perhaps in scientific fields as well. But also this idea that the book did not represent fixed meaning, but that it kind of actually encouraged a way of thinking that was very similar to the rise of the scientific method, where people began to kind of go, well, there's this piece here and this piece there. And how do these things go together? I read this thing there. And it led, she said, to a sense of power no longer being fixed in one singular priest of high status, but invested in people who were willing to invest themselves in texts and begin to question and debate, and therefore eventually this kind of coffeehouse culture that Habermas is talking about. But of course, slowly to mass literacy. Now, many of us don't realize how late mass literacy was. Mass literacy did not emerge until universal education became a thing in the 1920s. Until then, it was really unusual for everybody to be able to read in a society. You could argue that it was a blip in time that's going back down again. But certainly during this period, there were more and more people who could read. And so therefore, multiple interpretations and the rise of debate and feedback. And that's what Eisenstein has to say. So you can see over the history of the news here, that I won't go on at length about, that it also mirrors these technological changes and therefore produces with it social changes, and shifts the balance of power in a network of communication. So in this first image, I have an image of the town crier. Everyone's heard of this guy who used to go around going, "Hear ye, hear ye." But what people probably don't realize is that this was the way in which official news from the government, or from, and we're talking about from the king or the local principality, from the duchy, from the city of London, was distributed. And I'm talking about from the Roman era all the way until the 1890s, because mass literacy was not completely universal until the 20th century. So you had a town crier who conferred official news. But as you can see, and as criminology students here will know well, we have a picture of Robert Peel, who introduced the Metropolitan Police Act in 1829, which was the beginning of modern policing to London via Scotland Yard. And he was at first a minister, but he then not a minister of religion, a minister of government. And he later became the Prime Minister of England. But you can see this really lovely power dynamic going on in that cartoon, and that's why I've used this. People doubted official news for a very long time because they knew it was so tightly controlled. It was top-down communication, right? Not bottom-up, not debated. It was what the government wanted you to believe. It was propaganda, and people often felt like it was, right? Even though they didn't have that word back then. And so you can see, even though Robert Peel is introducing these new laws, and telling people what will happen, a bobby will arrest them for pickpocketing, you can see how the average person was sort of laughing, that even as he's announcing this, the town crier is announcing this, someone is picking his pocket and there's thieves just laughing. So, even though information is tightly controlled, and sometimes because it's tightly controlled, there'll be a response to it. So I've got a timeline there for you where you can stop and pause and look at this a little bit more if you want. But really, just the takeaway of this is that we really haven't had the modern free press for very long as a society in the long sweep of history. That it was really only after the First Amendment of the American Constitution in 1791, which was freedom of speech, that newspapers weren't just mouthpieces of the government anymore, that people felt safe enough to be able to scrutinize their government, for example. And it has often been noted that in early colonial America, in the 1740s, magazines like the Pennsylvania magazine played a really important role, actually, in fomenting the colony of the early Americas and of Pennsylvania, from which there were revolutionary, fomenting going on to overthrow and separate from England. So it is only then that we begin to start to think of the news as unbiased. We see the rise of the mass media then starting to happen around the 1800s with more developments in technology, and they're getting more affordable. You're seeing the rise of the telegraph being able to distribute news quickly from having a media person on the site at different cities, and the Associated Press is able to distribute news through that network then. And then you're seeing the rise of major metropolitan newspapers, such as the New York Times and the London Times, that in their earliest iterations were city newspapers, but became the same newspaper that everybody in the country was reading for a while. You see the rise of mass magazines, and then the radio, TV news, which was dominant when I was growing up. And then in the 1980s, the rise of para news, like the Oprah Winfrey Show and Current Affair and 60 Minutes. Late 1990s, we saw the emergence of digital news, famously breaking the Monica Lewinsky affair. So again, overthrowing government there, or attempting to. And then by 2016, we see the emergence of fake news being infiltrating social media sites, where there's this complete breakdown between establishment of fact and reality. So if you'd like to learn more about how important the medium is, the medium of communication is for how we think about ourselves and societies and our position in the networks or societies, a very famous communications theorist who was a Canadian as well was Marshall McLuhan, and you're welcome to look at this YouTube clip. I will also put in the pre-recording called "The Medium is the Massage," based on his book, "The Medium is the Message." I want to also think about how communication technologies don't just, you know, change over time, but we've been talking about how they change our relationships to power and authority. But I also want to think about how they change our relationships to each other and to place. And somebody who was very important for thinking about that was a theorist of communication called Benedict Anderson, who wrote a book in 1983 called Imagined Communities. And he said that there had been a critical role that the steam engine had played when it was able to connect all of the different colonies, for instance, in Australia, or all of the different individual states in the United States of America, or all of the different provinces in Canada as nations, because giant tracts of space and place could be covered very quickly. And he said what was happening during that period was you were getting, say, the New York Times distributed all across the country really quickly, and everybody was reading literally from the same page at the same time. And he said, so it's from the 1880s that you see the rise of the naturalization of the nation state instead of these smaller regions like the smaller colonies of Australia. And this profoundly changed our sense of ourselves and of our community. We were all reading about the same people and the same news on the same page every day. It also gave us a sense of unity as a nation. And of course, it gave the newspapers an enormous amount of power, but it also changed the power of how we imagine the naturalization of the nation, which is actually, of course, just a structure of governance, not necessarily something that, you know, is natural to the way a land is organized or the way we experience it. Now, we might also think about the emergence of private networks and public networks too. So newspapers and unified homogeneous nation space help to create the illusion of a homogeneous community. And this is what Anderson said, but he said the key was it was an illusion. Differences remained. Of course, there's a huge difference between being from West Coast, North America, and New York. There's a difference between being from the prairies or the Midwest, for example, or being from South. And so differences remained, even though everybody was reading these national newspapers at the same time. But in some situations, people develop their own ways of communicating. And in some situations, they've had to do so in private, in secret, because they did not have the power to share their stories otherwise. So some examples of that, for example, where communities formed ways to evade censorship or surveillance or judgment that was in the majority of hands, is the South African gumboot dance. You can look that one up if you want. It was a way that enslaved Black miners in South Africa learned how to stomp their boots, and it's the origin of the stomp dance that then in London produces eventually the musical Stomp. And it was a way that they learned how to use basically a kind of a Morse code that they developed amongst themselves to communicate in ways that would have been forbidden by their slave masters. Bajan is another such language. It was the language of Barbados that this enslaved people developed as a patois between them that often an Englishman couldn't understand. Or Polari, for example, which I'll also drop you the YouTube link on, which was a way that when homosexuality was outlawed, homosexual people in urban spaces learned how to communicate and gesture to each other to work out whether they too were gay and whether they could have an open conversation or relationship with that person. So we can see here the emergence of things like code switching for different audiences, for those who are inside our network and those who are outside. So I'm just going to leave this here for now because I've been going for 30 minutes and that's given you more than an hour of lecture today with lots of YouTube links to look at. And for those of you who are thinking of doing your blog this week, I'm going to let you have another section of the lecture, which is thinking about how we apply these ideas to the internet.